Hey guys, tonight we're doing something very different. We're not just looking back a few centuries, or even a few thousand years. We're traveling further back than we ever have before. Back to a time when the earth itself was almost unrecognizable. Picture this, the frozen north echoing with the thunder of colossal footsteps. Woolly mammoths, towering and shaggy, moving in herds across endless plains of ice and snow. They lived side by side with early humans, hunters armed with nothing but spears, courage, and fire, daring to take down beasts that weighed as much as a house. But far away from the icy tundras, another world existed. The Sahara Desert today, a vast ocean of golden sand, was once alive. Imagine rivers winding through fertile valleys, lakes glittering beneath the sun, forests filled with life, hippos, giraffes, even crocodiles thrived, where now only dust and heat remain. The Sahara was not a wasteland, it was a paradise, teeming with people, animals, and entire cultures that flourished, only to be swallowed when the desert claimed it all back. And while nature was busy reshaping continents, humanity was doing something equally extraordinary. In the middle of Peru's lifeless desert, an impossible city began to rise. Without iron, without wheels, without even beasts of burden. People built massive pyramids, temples, and plaza structures so advanced that archaeologists today still struggle to explain how it was even possible. A city born in the sand, where there should have been nothing. Think about that for a moment. A frozen world of mammoths, a green Sahara, alive with rivers, a mysterious city rising out of a barren desert. These are not myths, they are chapters of our shared human story, chapters that remind us that history is not a straight line, but a winding path full of lost worlds and forgotten miracles. And tonight, we're going to walk that path. We'll see how climate shifts turned grasslands into deserts, how ancient peoples adapted to worlds that vanished before their eyes, and how their creations still whisper to us across thousands of years. So buckle up, because this isn't just a story about history, it's about survival, transformation, and mystery. It's about how fragile and yet how powerful human civilization truly is. We're stepping into a past so strange, so alive, and so breathtaking, that you may not look at our world the same way again. Asterisk, asterisk, this isn't just another pile of stones in the desert. This isn't just another forgotten ruin. This is Cairo, one of the most astonishing cities ever uncovered. A metropolis so old it makes Stonehenge look modern, and so mysterious it shakes the foundations of everything we thought we knew about early civilization. Cairo rose nearly 5,000 years ago, in a barren stretch of the Peruvian desert where nothing should have survived. And yet here, people built something extraordinary, a sprawling city of pyramids, sunken plazas, staircases, and intricate dwellings, stretching across more than 150 acres. They engineered massive monuments long before the Egyptians even laid the first stones of the Great Pyramid. But here's the part that defies belief. Carol's people achieved all of this without weapons, without writing, and astonishingly without war. No fortresses, no battle scars, no signs of violent conquest. Instead, they thrived on trade, music, astronomy, and architecture, leaving behind flutes carved from condor bones, sacred fire pits, and structures aligned perfectly with the stars. Think about that. While much of the world was still scattered in small villages, Carol's people were creating a society built not on bloodshed, but on culture, science, and spirituality. A peaceful civilization, thriving in the harshest of deserts and centuries before the rise of the Mayans, the Aztecs, or even the Incas. Cairo is not just ancient, it is impossible. A city so far ahead of its time that it forces us to ask, how many chapters of human history have been erased by time? How many civilizations, built on ideas we can barely imagine, have risen and fallen before us? Before we dive in, I need you to do something really quick. Hit that like button and subscribe. I know every channel says it, but here's the truth. This film you're about to watch is different. It isn't a 10-minute summary. It isn't a recycled list. This is a 2-hour mega documentary, 6 months of research, thousands of pages of history, satellite maps, archaeological records, and interviews condensed into a single journey. And the only reason we can make projects like this is because of you. Your support, your comments, and your shares are what fuel these deep dives. So if you love uncovering the mysteries of our past, this is your way of keeping them alive. Now take a breath, clear your mind, because we're about to reset everything you thought you knew about human history. Civilizations that should not exist, landscapes that don't belong, and evidence that rewrites the very timeline of our species. Tonight we're not just asking what happened. We're asking what have we forgotten, and what else is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 1. Discovery, the natural hill's secret. The Soup Valley does not look like the cradle of civilization. 2 hours north of Lima, Peru, the landscape is stark, sun-baked and seemingly lifeless. A thin ribbon of green snakes through the valley fed by the Soup River, but beyond that fragile line of life lies an unforgiving desert. Here the wind cuts like a blade. The sand shifts endlessly, piling up in dunes and ridges that look almost like waves frozen in time. To the casual eye, the place offers little beyond desolation. For centuries, locals had lived quietly along the riverbanks, farming small plots, herding animals, and telling stories about the strange shapes that dotted the landscape. Low, rounded mounds rose out of the desert, scattered in curious clusters. Farmers plowed around them, children played on them, shepherds rested in their shadows. Everyone in the valley had grown up with these lomas naturales hills. That's what they looked like, oddly geometric lumps of earth. Some taller, some smaller, covered in scraggly weeds and sandy dust. They blended into the horizon so seamlessly that no one gave them a second thought. At most, people muttered that the mounds were a little too symmetrical, a little too steep to be natural. But what could they be? This was the desert. Civilization, everyone knew, had sprung from the old world. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. Not here, not in Peru. And yet, under those sun-bleached mounds, something astonishing lay buried. 1994, Ruth Shady's first survey in 1994. Dr. Shade Solis, a Peruvian archaeologist from the National University of San Marcos, made her first survey of the Soup Valley. By this time, she was already respected in the academic world for her meticulous work on Peru's coastal cultures, but she was restless. Most Andean archaeology focused on the famous civilizations, the Incas, the Mocha, the Nazca, with their mysterious lines etched into the desert floor. Shady was convinced there was more, much more, hiding in plain sight. So she came to the Soup Valley, armed with notebooks, a handful of students, and a sharp eye for patterns. Walking the arid landscape, she immediately noticed what the farmers had lived alongside for generations, the natural hills. But to her, they didn't look natural at all. They looked planned, constructed. She paced around one of the larger mounds, her boots crunching in the gravelly sand. The slope was too steep, too uniform. She measured angles, marked lines, and compared distances. If you stripped away centuries of wind-blown dust, she thought, what would you see? A platform, a staircase, a structure that someone, long ago, had built with purpose. Her students were skeptical. These were just dunes, they said. Piles of earth and stone shaped by wind and erosion. Surely, if there had been something here, someone would have uncovered it by now. But Shady wasn't so sure. She had studied the ancient Peruvian coast for decades, and she knew how icily time and sand could conceal even the grandest architecture. As she moved through the valley, she realized the mounds weren't scattered randomly. They were aligned, clustered in groups. Some faced each other across plazas. Others seemed connected by straight, deliberate pathways. This was not chaos. This was design. That night, she wrote in her notes, "These are not hills. These are monuments." Farmers' accounts of weird mounds. To confirm her suspicions, Shady began speaking with the locals. The farmers had their own stories about the mounds. Some said they found strange stones when plowing the fields flat, rectangular blocks buried deep beneath the soil. Others claimed that when heavy rains came, bits of carved rock and broken pottery would wash down from the slopes. One old man told her he had once uncovered a wall beneath the sand, perfectly straight and smooth. "It was not from our time," he said, shaking his head. "It was from the people before, from the ancients." Children, too, whispered about the mounds. They said they were haunted, that if you climbed to the top at night, you could hear voices in the wind. Shadows flickered across the slopes. Strange music flutes, drums echoed from nowhere. Shady didn't dismiss these tales. Folk memories, she knew, often preserved fragments of truth. And besides, the children were right about one thing. These mounds did have a voice, if you knew how to listen. Initial skepticism from the archaeological community. When Shady brought her observations back to Lima, she was met with polite nods, raised eyebrows, and, in some cases, outright dismissal. The academic consensus was firm. South America's first great civilization was flourishing around 900 BCE in the Andean highlands. Anything older was considered primitive small villages, perhaps, but nothing like Egypt or Soup. Her colleagues listened as she laid out her surveys, her maps, her arguments. The mounds are artificial. Plazas, staircases, pyramids. This was a city, an ancient city. The response was predictable, impossible. Speculation, wishful thinking. One colleague told her bluntly, "If what you're saying is true, Ruth, it would rewrite history." and history is not so easily rewritten, but she had learned long ago that truth does not bend to consensus. It was out there, buried under centuries of sand, waiting to be uncovered, and she would uncover it. The smoking gun, the breakthrough came when Shady and her team began to dig in earnest. With careful excavation, they revealed stone walls, staircases, and terraces beneath the mounds. The geometry was undeniable. These were pyramids, monumental architecture of staggering scale. But still, questions lingered. How old were they? To answer, Shady collected samples of red mats, woven bags, and plant fibers embedded in the structures. These were sent to laboratories for radiocarbon dating. When the results came back, they stunned everyone. 2627. Carol, the name Shady gave to the site, was not just old, it was ancient, older than the Great Pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, as old as the earliest Sumerian city-states in Mesopotamia. The news rippled through the archaeological world like an earthquake. South America's first great civilization was not. The it was Carol, and it was 4,600 years old. Shady looked at the numbers again and again, almost unable to believe them herself. This changes everything, she thought, and she was right. Chapter 2. The city engineering marvels. When Ruth Shady and her team began clearing the sands of Carol, the scale of the city started to emerge piece by piece. What had once seemed like lopsided hills of rock and dust revealed themselves as carefully constructed pyramids, plazas, and platforms, works of engineering that should not have been possible in a society this ancient. The crown jewel was what archaeologists came to call the Pyramid Maya, the Great Pyramid of Carol, rising 60 feet high and stretching more than 450 feet in length. It dominated the heart of the city like a stone mountain crafted by human hands. From its summit you could see the entire Soup Valley, the fertile green ribbon carved by the river, the brown desert stretching endlessly beyond, the smaller pyramids and plazas scattered like constellations across the plain. But this was not just a pile of rocks. The Pyramid Maya was a marvel of precision. Layers of stone walls and terraces were carefully filled with smaller rocks and bundles of woven reed bags called shikras. Each shikra was filled with stones and stacked in such a way that the pyramid could absorb the shock of earthquakes. Peru lies in one of the most seismically active zones in the world. Earthquakes are not occasional, they are inevitable. And yet, Carol's builders had engineered a solution that allowed their monuments to stand for nearly 5,000 years. When tremors rippled through the desert, the shikras shifted ever so slightly, dispersing energy like cushions. Modern engineers, examining the technique, have admitted its brilliance. In effect, the Carol builders created one of the earliest known anti-seismic construction systems in human history. As archaeologists dug deeper, another surprise emerged. Many of Carol's pyramids and plazas were not silent spaces of stone, they were tuned, like instruments. At the base of several pyramids, sunken circular amphitheaters were uncovered. These structures were perfect circles, with stairways descending into their depths, lined with carefully set stone walls. Standing inside one of these, you could hear your voice echo in strange, amplified ways. A whisper became a ripple. A chant could carry across the plaza. Flutes and drums, when played inside, resonated with deep, otherworldly tones. It was as if the builders had engineered acoustics into the city itself. Imagine, thousands of years ago, hundreds of people gathered in these amphitheaters, priests chanting at the base of the pyramid, music vibrating through the air, the walls of stone amplifying the sound so that every ear in the city could feel the rhythm. For a society without writing, sound was power. Rituals, announcements, and performances could shape collective memory. Carol was not just engineered for stability, it was engineered for spectacle. The more the city revealed itself, the clearer it became that Carol was not primitive, it was purposeful. Every stone, every angle, every plaza served a role in creating a society that was both resilient and awe-inspiring. Urban planning, but pyramids alone do not make a city. Carol was more than monuments, it was a living, breathing urban organism. The excavations showed a city carefully divided into zones. At the center, towering pyramids and ceremonial plazas dominated the landscape, the beating heart of public life. Around them stretched residential sectors, with houses of varying sizes. Some were modest, small, single-room dwellings with hearths and storage pits. Others were sprawling, multi-room complexes with courtyards and decorated walls. The difference was not random. Archaeologists began to see patterns. Social hierarchy reflected in architecture. Elites lived closest to the ceremonial core, in larger, more complex homes. Ordinary citizens lived further out, in simpler dwellings. But even the simplest houses showed signs of order and permanence. This was no temporary camp of nomads. It was a city with planned districts, where thousands of people lived, worked, and worshipped. And then there was the sky. Shady and her team noticed that several of Carol's structures were not just aligned to each other, they were aligned to the heavens. Pyramids and sightlines pointed toward the rising and setting of the sun during the solstices. Stone markers hinted at observations of lunar cycles. In a desert where survival depended on timing when to plant, when to harvest, when the river would flood, the stars were not decoration, they were guides. Carol, it seemed, had its own astronomers, embedding their knowledge into the bones of the city. Just as the Egyptians aligned their pyramids with Orion and the North Star, Carol aligned its monuments with the sun. Civilization, it turned out, had many centers, and the sky united them all. But perhaps the most ingenious feature was not in the stars above, but in the river below. Carol's people lived in a desert where water was life. Archaeologists found evidence of irrigation canals branching from the Soup River, channeling water into fields where cotton, beans, squash, and guava grew. They also discovered retention systems designed to prevent flooding during seasonal rains. In a land where too little water meant famine and too much meant destruction, the people of Carol had built a delicate balance. This was urban planning at its finest, not just monuments for the gods, but infrastructure for survival. The workforce puzzled with every discovery, a new question arose. How did they do it? The pyramid mayor alone required the movement of tens of thousands of tons of stone. The plazas stretched wide enough to gather entire communities. The irrigation canals spanned miles. And yet, archaeologists found no evidence of slave labor. No chains, no whips, no mass graves of workers sacrificed to gods or kings. This puzzled researchers. Almost every other ancient civilization, except Mesopotamia, Rome, left traces of forced labor in their great works. But Carol seemed different. The absence of weapons in the archaeological record added to the mystery. No fortresses, no walls bristling with defenses, no swords, spears, or arrowheads. It seemed Carol's people had achieved their monumental feats, not through conquest or coercion, but through something else entirely. One theory is that construction was communal. Families and neighborhoods may have pooled their labor as part of ritual obligations, or as contributions to a shared project that bound the community together. The amphitheaters and plazas suggest collective gatherings were central to Carol's life. Why not collective building as well? Modern experiments have tried to estimate the caloric demand of constructing Carol's pyramids. Moving stones, weaving shikros, stacking terraces. Thousands of workers would have needed thousands of calories per day. Cotton farming, fishing from the Pacific coast, and irrigation-fed crops could have provided the fuel. In effect, the city may have functioned like an ecosystem, balancing labor, food, and ritual in a cycle that sustained both people and monuments. Carol's pyramids, then, were not only feats of engineering, they were feats of social organization. Every stone carried was not just a block of rock, but a testament to cooperation. Chapter 3. Daily Life, Diet, and Cuisine. Eating in the world's first city of the Americas. When archaeologists sift through the dust of Carol, the grand pyramidal city resting in Peru's Soup Valley, they find more than monumental stone and forgotten walls. They find the traces of meals, charred fish bones, blackened squash seeds, brittle guava skins, cotton threads still clinging to fragments of netting. To a casual observer, these might look like mere scraps of garbage, but to the trained eye, they are as significant as the pyramids themselves. Food is culture in its most intimate form. It is the rhythm of survival, the fuel of construction, and often, the most honest record of how people lived day to day. In Carol, food did more than sustain. It structured society, linked coast to highlands, and bound sacred rituals with daily labor. The remains recovered at the site tell us of a diet simultaneously humble and ingenious. Simple ingredients, but orchestrated into a sustainable system that kept tens of thousands alive in a desert city where rain rarely falls. Anchovies and the sea's gift. The Soup Valley lies just a few miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. Today, it is dry, almost barren, with the Andes looming in the distance and the desert pressing down on both sides. Yet the people of Carol thrived here, and their secret weapon was the sea. The Pacific, off Peru's coast, is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, thanks to the Humboldt Current, a cold stream of nutrient-rich water that attracts plankton, which in turn attracts vast shoals of fish, chief among them, anchovies. At Carol, archaeologists have uncovered countless anchovy bones, preserved by desert conditions. These weren't scraps of a rare delicacy, they were the foundation of daily sustenance, protein-packed, easily dried, and transportable, Anchovies became the grain of the coast, the staple food without which the city could never have grown. But anchovies weren't eaten alone. They were paired with carbohydrates and vegetables grown in irrigated fields near the Soup River: squash, beans, sweet potatoes, and guava. This combination created a diet that was surprisingly balanced. Fish supplied protein and omega oils, beans added more protein and fiber, squash and tubers contributed vitamins, guava offered natural sugar and vitamin C. It was a cuisine of necessity, yes, but also of sustainability, and like all cuisines, it shaped culture. Cotton, the oil of the ancient Andes. If anchovies were the staple food, cotton was the staple resource. Carroll's farmers cultivated vast fields of cotton not for clothing or decoration but for fishing nets. Without cotton there were no nets, without nets there were no fish, without fish there was no Carroll. This triangular relationship, cotton, nets, fish, formed the invisible engine that powered the city. Archaeologists have even found fragments of ancient netting, the fibers still knotted after 5,000 years. Some nets were small, designed for river fishing. Others were massive, strong enough to pull in entire schools of anchovies from the ocean. In this sense, cotton was more valuable than gold. It was the oil of its day, the indispensable resource around which everything else revolved. Trade caravans carried Carroll's cotton inland, exchanging it with highland communities for coca leaves and obsidian. Cotton transformed agriculture into industry, industry into economy, and economy into power. And when the people of Carroll feasted, they knew they were tasting not just food, but the fruits of an entire system of labor and exchange. Squash, beans, and guava. Farming the desert. When we picture ancient civilizations, we often imagine lush valleys like the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates. Carroll had no such blessing. The Soup Valley was a desert strip, flanked by mountains and ocean, with only the thin ribbon of the Soup River offering water. Yet the people here engineered irrigation systems that turned sand into farmland. Their fields produced hardy crops suited for arid conditions. Squash, nutritious, storable, and versatile. Seeds were roasted, flesh eaten fresh, shells dried into containers. Beans, including lima beans and other legumes that paired perfectly with fish to create complete proteins. Guava, sweet, high in vitamin C, likely eaten fresh or fermented. Together, these crops complemented the ocean harvest, creating a diet that sustained laborers and elites alike. But food wasn't just about survival, it was also about ritual. Chicha, the sacred beer. Every civilization invents a ritual drink. In Mesopotamia, it was beer from barley. In the Andes, it was chicha, fermented brew made from maize, fruit, or other starches. At Carroll, the evidence points to guava-based chicha. Archaeologists have uncovered residues in gourds and jars suggesting fermentation. While maize had not yet become the dominant crop in coastal Peru, guava was abundant, and when left to ferment it produces a mildly alcoholic drink. Chicha was more than refreshment. It was sacred. It accompanied feasts, rituals, and perhaps even political negotiations. When amphitheaters in Carroll rang with music, chicha was likely flowing. When workers completed a stage of pyramid construction, chicha may have sealed the celebration. Alcohol has always been a social technology, lowering barriers, binding communities, turning work into festival. In Carroll it was no different. Ritual feasting, food as ceremony. The pyramids and sunken plazas of Carroll weren't just ceremonial, they were built to host gatherings. And what is a gathering without food? Archaeologists suspect that Carroll's elites organized ritual feasts, drawing people together from across the valley. Imagine it, a procession enters the plaza, fires burn at the edges, fish stew simmers in clay pots, guava chicha passes from hand to hand. Musicians play flutes carved from condor bones, their eerie tones echoing in the amphitheater. Shamans perhaps chew coca leaves, their minds drifting into altered states. In such moments, food was not just sustenance but symbolism. Eating anchovies and beans under the shadow of the pyramid Maya wasn't simply a meal, it was participation in a cosmic order. It reinforced social bonds, reaffirmed leadership, and sanctified labor. The diet of Carroll was thus inseparable from its spiritual life. Trade networks. Tastes from afar. While most food was local, some ingredients traveled long distances. The discovery of spondylus shells from Ecuador and coca leaves from the Amazon at Carroll proves that trade routes spanned hundreds of miles. Spondylus shells weren't eaten, they were sacred objects, prized in ritual, but coca leaves were consumed, chewed with lime to release alkaloids, giving energy and focus. In the thin air of the Andes, coca helped highland peoples endure. In Carroll, coca may have carried both medicinal and ritual significance. Such finds remind us that Carroll wasn't an isolated experiment. It was a hub in a wider Andean world. connected by caravans of llamas and human porters. Its cuisine, humble as it might appear, was enriched by exotic imports. Sustainability in the workforce. One of the most striking things about Carroll's food system is its efficiency. Despite building monumental pyramids, archaeologists find no evidence of slavery. Instead, they suspect a communal labor model where people contributed work in exchange for food, ritual, and status. To feed a workforce capable of raising massive pyramids required planning. Caloric studies suggest thousands of anchovies, beans, and squash meals were prepared daily. Cooking likely took place in communal areas where fires burned constantly. This was not exploitation in the old world sense. It was a different kind of social contract: food for labor, ritual for loyalty, survival for cooperation. And the diet of Carroll was the glue that held it together. Conclusion: a cuisine that built pyramids. When we step back, Carroll's diet might seem plain. No golden banquets of Egypt, no wheat bread of Mesopotamia, no olives and wine of the Mediterranean, just anchovies, beans, squash, guava, cotton, and chicha. But therein lies its genius. With limited resources, Carroll's people engineered a cuisine that was balanced, sustainable, and scalable. It fed a city of tens of thousands in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It allowed pyramids to rise, amphitheaters to echo with music, and rituals to unfold under the stars. Food, in Carroll, was civilization. Chapter 4. The Enigma of Peace, a civilization without weapons. When we picture the ancient world, we often see it drenched in blood. From Mesopotamia's walled cities constantly bracing against rival city-states, to the pyramids of Egypt guarded by armed elites, to the warlords of the Indus and the sacrificial obsidian blades of Mesoamerica, violence seems the inescapable backdrop of early civilization. Walls, weapons, scars of destruction. These are the ruins that dominate history books. And yet, in the Soup Valley of Peru, where Carroll rose 5,000 years ago, archaeologists stumbled upon something unexpected, perhaps even unsettling to the narrative we've told ourselves about human nature. They found no fortifications, no charred rubble from sieges, no mass graves from warfare, no depictions of spearmen or conquerors on temple walls. Carroll, a city of monumental scale and complex society, seems to have thrived for centuries without organized war. This is not a silence by accident. The absence of weapons is not due to decay, nor a quirk of excavation. If Carroll's people forged armies, fought wars, or glorified combat, the traces should be visible: broken blades, defensive ramparts, mural depictions of victory. Instead, the material record speaks only of trade, ritual, agriculture, music, and astronomy. It is a record of a people who organized themselves not around conquest, but around cooperation. How could this be? How could one of the earliest great cities in the Americas, the so-called mother of Andean civilization, prosper without war when so many of its contemporaries were built on bloodshed? The silence of the battlefield. Archaeologist Ruth Shady, who led the modern rediscovery of Carroll, often emphasizes this absence. She calls it one of the most striking features of the city. In site after site across the Soup Valley, researchers unearth woven textiles, ritual objects, musical instruments, and tools for construction. But they do not find weapons of war. The tools that do appear: knives, clubs, stone blades are utilitarian. They were used for farming, fishing, food preparation, and ritual. None bear the modifications or mass production signs typical of weaponry. The city itself is open, unfortified, as though designed in confidence that enemies would not come. Some skeptics have asked, could the absence simply mean we haven't looked hard enough? But in archaeology, destruction leaves scars that can't easily be hidden. Burned layers in the soil, bodies buried hastily in pits, fortification ditches. Even in small-scale violence, evidence lingers. Yet in Carroll, none of these scars exist. Instead, the soil layers show continuity: construction, rebuilding, ritual burning of offerings, but never the chaos of conquest. If Carroll's say silence is real, and evidence suggests it forces us to ask difficult questions about the relationship between civilization and violence. Must complex societies inevitably be violent? Or does Carroll represent a different path, a brief shining experiment in collective peace? The global context, a world of blood and fire. To appreciate Carroll's uniqueness, we need to look outward, to its contemporaries around the globe. Mesopotamia, Sumer, say, Tres Mu BCAT. The cradle of civilization was also the cradle of organized warfare. City-states like Uruk-yor and Lagash competed violently over land and water. Fortified walls rose skyward. Inscriptions glorified kings as warriors, and art celebrated scenes of victory. Captives paraded in chains, enemies crushed beneath chariots. War was not only present but central to identity. Egypt's Old Kingdom, c. 2700 to 2200 BCE. Though Egypt projected itself as unified and divine, violence underpinned its consolidation. Armies marched to Nubia and Sinai. Military expeditions enforced the pharaoh's will, and fortresses guarded borders. The pyramids themselves were products of centralized authority that relied on force, whether physical or ideological. Indus Valley Civilization, c. 2600 to 1900 BCE. The Indus is an interesting comparison because it too shows limited evidence of warfare. Cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had few signs of weapons or conquest, but unlike Cairo, they had walls and planned fortifications. Some scholars argue those walls were more for flood control than defense, but the Indus is often considered the closest parallel society of commerce and planning, with minimal militarism. Early Mesoamerica Olmec precursors, c. 2000 to 1500 BCE. Here, we find violence woven into ritual and politics. Carved monuments depict rulers as warriors. Jaguar imagery symbolizes ferocity. And later Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya and Aztec would amplify war into both cosmic and political necessity. By comparison, Cairo stands out not only in the Andes but globally. It resembles the Indus in its peacefulness, yet differs in its openness. No walls, no fortifications. It is more radical in its rejection of militarism. Why did Cairo not need war? The question then becomes, what made Cairo different? Theories abound. Geographic isolation. The Soup Valley was not a crossroads of empires. It was somewhat isolated on Peru's coast, connected by rivers to the highlands but not threatened by expansive states. Without large neighbors to fight, there was little external pressure to militarize. Abundance of trade, not scarcity. Cairo's society thrived on long-distance exchange. Cotton grown in the valley was traded for fish from the coast, fruits from nearby zones, and exotic goods like spondylus shells from Ecuador. Trade networks created mutual dependence. Instead of raiding neighbors, Cairo needed them as partners. Religious and social cohesion. The massive pyramids and plazas of Cairo suggest society was organized around ritual, not warfare. Religion may have functioned as the glue, channeling energy into feasts, music, and temple offerings instead of battles. Different leadership models. Where Mesopotamia celebrated kings as warriors, Cairo's rulers seem to have been priest-astronomers. Their authority came not from military might but from managing agriculture, interpreting celestial cycles, and organizing construction. The shock of peace. It is tempting to romanticize Cairo as a utopia, but the truth is likely more complex. Peace does not mean equality. Hierarchies existed, with elites living in monumental residences and commoners laboring on construction. Ritual sacrifices, though not human in Cairo's case, were part of life. Power still flowed from temples, but the absence of war is still staggering. It suggests a deliberate cultural choice, an ethos that prioritized stability and cosmic order over conquest. To live without war was not the default of humanity. It had to be constructed, nurtured, maintained. Cairo's achievement was not simply that it avoided violence, but that it built monumental civilization without needing it. Chapter 5. Collapse. The long twilight of Cairo's civilizations rarely end with a bang. More often they unravel with a whisper. Buildings left unfinished, hearths gone cold, tools abandoned Meduse, and stories never written down. Cairo, the great city of the Soup Valley, did not vanish in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, it experienced a slow fading from prominence, a gradual retreat of life and energy that left behind one of history's most haunting mysteries. How could the world's first city of the Americas, a thriving hub of architecture, trade, and spirituality dissolved into silence. To answer this question, scholars have turned not only to the stones of Carol, but to the skies above, the soils beneath, and the rivers that once brought life through the desert. What emerges is a portrait of collapse rooted not in war or invasion, but in the unforgiving cycles of nature-climate change, river shifts, and ecological strain that pushed even the most ingenious people to their limits. The fragile oasis Carol was born in a paradox. It was a metropolis in the middle of a desert, sustained not by fertile plains or endless rains, but by rivers descending from the Andes. These waterways transformed the barren valley into a patchwork of green fields. Cotton, gourds, beans, and sweet potatoes flourished, feeding thousands and fueling a sophisticated economy. But such abundance was always precarious. A shift in the rivers, a season of too much water or too little, could unbalance the entire system. The Soup River was the city's lifeline, yet rivers in Peru are restless creatures, fed by glaciers, rainstorms, and seasonal flows. They could swell with destructive floods during El Niño years or shrink into trickles during drought. Carroll's engineers built canals, irrigation ditches, and terraces, trying to tame these waters. For centuries, they succeeded, but nature was patient, and the balance could not last forever. Ice and dust, signs from the Andes. Clues to Carroll's twilight do not come solely from its ruins. High in the Andes, ice core drilled from glaciers preserve a frozen record of ancient climates. Within their layers, scientists have traced sudden spikes of warmth, prolonged droughts, and catastrophic floods, all within the centuries when Carroll began to falter. Around 1800 BCE, the data reveals a turbulent period, shifting rainfall patterns, weakening river flows, and a fragile agricultural system increasingly strained to its breaking point. When the rains failed, canals ran dry, and cotton fields withered in the sun. Without cotton, Carroll lost not only clothing and fishing nets, but also the very currency of its trade. When the rains returned too fiercely, fields flooded, homes washed away, and silt smothered farmlands. Both extremes were deadly. The river moves away. Archaeologists studying sediment layers in the Soup Valley discovered something striking. The river that once nourished Carroll had gradually shifted course. What was once a reliable artery for irrigation abandoned its bed and carved a new path, leaving canals useless and fields barren. For a city built around agriculture, such a change was nothing short of devastating. The people of Carroll had mastered monumental architecture, sacred fire pits, and complex social organization, but they could not command the river. The relocation of water was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A canal ran a little drier, a harvest yielded a little less. Year after year, the decline accumulated until the city no longer sustained its population. Dust in the fields. Another clue lies in the land itself. Soil analysis shows that repeated cultivation without rest gradually depleted the valley's fertility. Dust storms, driven by desert winds, blew across exhausted fields, carrying away precious topsoil. The lush fields that once shimmered green were replaced by patches of sterile earth. Agriculture, the foundation of Carroll's wealth, was quietly crumbling beneath the people's feet. The image is haunting, massive pyramids rising over emptying fields, monumental plazas where fewer and fewer people gathered, feasts reduced to scarcity. Population decline may have been steady rather than sudden. Families likely moved downriver in search of more fertile lands, or migrated to other valleys where rivers still flowed reliably. Oral traditions suggest that later Andean cultures carried fragments of Carroll's knowledge, its music, its textiles, perhaps even its religious symbols into new settlements. The city itself withered, but its cultural DNA spread across the Andes, a civilization without an ending by 1500 BCE. Carroll was a shadow of itself. The pyramids still stood, silent against the desert sky, but the plazas were empty. The great festivals no longer echoed with flutes and drums. The river had moved, the fields had failed, and the people had drifted away. Yet Carroll's decline was not annihilation. Its knowledge lived on. The emphasis on harmony with natural cycles, the monumental architecture that aligned with stars, The economic networks based on cotton and fish, these ideas survived and influenced later Andean civilizations, like and beyond. Carol's story is not one of tragic failure, but of inevitable adaptation. When the valley could no longer support life, its people carried their traditions elsewhere. The city died, but the civilization endured in spirit. The lesson of Carol, what makes Carol's collapse so compelling, is its resonance with today. It reminds us that even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to environmental shifts. Carol thrived for centuries without war, building a city based on cooperation, trade, and shared ritual. But climate, rivers, and soil forces beyond human control ultimately decided its fate. Civilizations do not always end in fire and conquest. Sometimes, they fade into silence, leaving behind questions that echo across time. Archaeologists are no longer limited to broken walls and abandoned hearths. They now turn to the sciences of climate and environment, disciplines that extract hidden histories from the most unlikely of places. High in the Peruvian Andes, where glaciers gleam under the thin air, lies a vast archive of Timon archive written not in ink or stone, but in layers of ice. The frozen library of the Andes, the Cuelcaya ice cap, perched over 5,600 meters above sea level, is the largest tropical ice mass in the world. To the people of ancient Peru, it was a sacred place, a dazzling mirror of the sun, a dwelling of spirits, the fountainhead of rivers. To modern scientists, it is a vault. Every year, snowfall compacted into thin, distinct layers of ice. Over millennia, these layers stacked like pages of a book, preserving traces of the air, dust, and water of long-forgotten centuries. By drilling cores deep into the glacier, researchers have unlocked a climate record stretching back more than 5,000 years, the very span of Carol's rise and fall. Inside these cylinders of ice, the chemistry is precise and unforgiving. Tiny bubbles preserve the atmosphere of ages past. Oxygen isotopes, delicate variations in molecular weight, whisper of temperature shifts and rainfall cycles. Even the faint traces of volcanic ash mark distant eruptions, carried on winds across continents. Reading these signals, scientists have reconstructed a timeline of the climate that framed Carol's world. The drought at the edge of time, one of the most dramatic findings, emerges around 2200 BC, the very period when Carol began to falter. The isotope data reveals a marked reduction in precipitation across the Andes. This was not an isolated dry year or two. It was a sustained drought, stretching across decades, punctuated only by sudden, destructive storms. The snow melt that fed the great rivers dwindled. Seasonal flows became unreliable for societies dependent on delicate irrigation networks in desert valleys. This was nothing short of an existential threat. Imagine Carol's farmers watching the canals run shallow, the fields of cotton and beans withering under the sun. The mighty Soup River, once steady and nourishing, began to shrink. It still flowed, but not with the reliability on which the entire civilization depended. Carol was not a city built on endless abundance, it was a city balanced on a knife's edge of water. That balance was tipping. El Niño's wrath, as if drought were not enough. The ice records and marine sediment cores also point to intensified El Niño events during this same period. El Niño, the periodic warming of the Pacific Ocean, brings torrential rains and floods to the normally dry Peruvian coast. For Carol, this meant a cruel cycle. Years of drought followed by sudden floods that tore through canals and drowned fields and drowned fields. A farmer's labor could be undone in a single storm, while the next year might bring only dust. Evidence of such catastrophic flooding has been found in the sediment layers near Carolthic deposits of silt, where fertile soils should have been, and signs of collapsed irrigation channels overwhelmed by violent surges of water. In ecological terms, Carol was trapped between two extremes: not enough water to live, and too much water to survive. The vanishing rivers. The real catastrophe of climate change for Carol was not the storm, but the silence that followed. Less precipitation in the Andes meant less snowpack. Less snowpack meant thinner trickles of melt water. The rivers, those slender blue lifelines cutting through the Peruvian desert, grew unreliable. For a civilization like Carol, this was catastrophic. Without rivers, there was no irrigation. Without irrigation, there was no cotton, no beans, no surplus to support a city of priests, artisans, and builders. The monumental pyramids, the sunken plazas, the sacred fire pits, all of it was sustained by the steady pulse of the rivers. When that pulse faltered, Carol's heart began to slow. The human experience of drought to the modern eye. Isotope data and glacial chemistry may seem abstract, but behind the science lies human suffering. For the families of Carol, a drought was not just numbers, it was empty baskets, hungry children, and the uncertainty of tomorrow's meal. It was the desperation of redigging canals in search of water that would not come. It was the silence of a plaza where festivals could no longer be held because there was no surplus to celebrate. For the priests and leaders of Carol, the changing skies posed a spiritual crisis as well. Their authority was tied to their ability to interpret the cosmos, to maintain harmony with the forces of nature. When the rains failed, when the rivers shrank, when offerings no longer brought balance, trust in leadership may have eroded. Rituals that once bound the community together became reminders of their helplessness against forces beyond control. A collapse written in ice. The beauty of ice cores is that they align perfectly with the archaeological record. As the isotopes trace a long drought punctuated by floods, the city itself tells the same story. Construction slowed, fields were abandoned, houses were ritually closed. The decline of Carol was not sudden, it was a drawn-out struggle against a climate that no longer cooperated. By around 1800 BCE, the archaeological record shows that Carol was largely abandoned. The pyramids stood silent, the plazas empty. Meanwhile, the ice of Quelcaya and other glaciers continued to accumulate, preserving the invisible fingerprints of the very droughts and storms that unraveled the city below. Lessons in fragility. Carol's climate story is not just about the past, it is a warning. The people of Carol had no factories, no coal, no fossil fuels. Yet even in their time, the smallest shifts in climate spelled disaster. Today, with a global climate system under far greater stress, the echoes of Carol's fate are impossible to ignore. A civilization's survival depends not just on ingenuity and architecture, but on its relationship with the natural systems that feed it. The skies and the ice remind us, nature does not bend forever. Rivers shift, rains fail, glaciers melt. And when they do, even the greatest cities can fall silent. The Dust Bowl effect on agriculture. Archaeologists excavating late-period Carol households have noticed something striking. Increasing layers of wind-blown sand and dust covering abandoned floors. These deposits suggest fields lying fallow, irrigation breaking down, and desert sands reclaiming the land. This Andean dust bowl was not unlike the environmental crises faced by later societies in different corners of the world. The collapse of the Maya in Mesoamerica or the fall of Mesopotamian cities due to salinization. In Carol, the problem was compounded by reliance on irrigation in a desert environment. As the land dried, the productivity of farms declined. Without reliable harvests, there would have been food shortages, social strain, and eventually a tipping point where the costs of staying outweighed the benefits. The slow fade. Carol's gradual decline. Last construction phases. One of the clearest markers of decline at Carol is the archaeology of its pyramids and plazas. In the early centuries, monumental construction was vigorous. Teams hauled stone, reshaped plazas, and expanded ceremonial centers. But in the final centuries, evidence suggests smaller, hastily built structures, sometimes incorporating recycled materials from older buildings. The Pyramid Maya, once the crown jewel of the city, shows signs of partial renovation that was never completed. Staircases lead to nowhere. Walls are left half-finished. This is the material echo of a society losing its capacity to mobilize large labor forces. Monumental ambition was shrinking. Carol's once energetic urban pulse was slowing to a faint beat. Household abandonment patterns. When archaeologists step into the domestic zones of Carol, they do not find the charred ruins of conquest or the rubble of violent destruction. Instead, they encounter something subtler, almost melancholic, a landscape of homes that were not toppled but emptied. This silence speaks volumes. It suggests that the unraveling of Carol was not a dramatic collapse in the way we often imagine, no invading army sweeping through, no firestorms of destruction, but rather a gradual fading, a thinning of life, a population that slowly turned away from its monumental heart. Signs in the floors and walls. The residential structures of Carol's mall, rectangular houses of stone and clay, clustered near the plazas and monumental platforms, reveal clues about their final moments of occupation. Archaeologists have discovered grinding stones left on benches, baskets leaning in corners, and weaving tools lying where they were last set down. These objects were not gathered and packed for relocation. They were simply left behind, as though the family intended to return after a short absence, and yet they never did. In some households, hearths, once the warm beating hearts of family life, were found cold, carefully covered with layers of earth or stone. This was not random abandonment, it was a gesture. In Andean cultures, fire was sacred. Extinguishing a hearth often carried ritual meaning, perhaps signaling a respectful closing of the household's spirit before departure. Floors were swept clean, walls maintained, as if the inhabitants wanted to leave the dwelling in good order, acknowledging the home's role in their lives before moving on. The ritual of leaving such evidence points to the possibility that Carol's citizens did not flee in fear but departed with ceremony. Some houses even contained small offerings, shells, beads, fragments of food left behind, perhaps as gifts to the spirits of the home or to the earth itself. This practice fits within broader Andean traditions, where transitions, birth, death, planting, harvest, migration were rarely seen as abrupt breaks, but as phases marked by ritual. In this light, Carol's gradual depopulation may not have been perceived as a failure at all. It may have been understood as part of a cosmic cycle, a necessary movement of people toward more fertile valleys, guided by the rhythms of water and land. What archaeologists interpret as abandonment might have been, to the people themselves, a respectful handing back of place to the earth. The thinning of a city excavation patterns show that not all neighborhoods emptied at once. Some areas of Carol's urban core remained occupied longer than others, suggesting a piecemeal departure. Families may have first left peripheral zones as fields failed, while others clung to the city's heart near the pyramids, plazas, in temples, hoping the spiritual power of Carol could restore balance to the land. But over time, even these sacred centers lost their crowds. The plazas that once echoed with music and festivals grew quieter. The fire pits that had glowed with offerings to the gods were extinguished more often than lit. Where thousands once gathered for ritual and trade, only small clusters of people remained, until even they, too, drifted away. Migration, not extinction. Importantly, the archaeological record suggests that Carol's people did not vanish. They dispersed like a river, dividing into many streams. The population spread into other valleys and regions, carrying with them fragments of Carol's knowledge and traditions. Later Andean cultures, Chabin, Paracas, Nazca, echo aspects of Carol's legacy. Their textile patterns, their emphasis on ritual music, their monumental stone architecture. These were not inventions born in isolation, they were inheritances carried by migrating people whose ancestral hearths once burned in Carol. Thus, the household abandonment patterns are not evidence of a vanished people but of a transformed one. The city itself could not endure the ecological pressures, but its spirit lived on in the movements and memories of its people. A portrait of quiet departure. Imagine the scene. A family gathers their essentials, perhaps food stores and portable belongings, while leaving behind heavier tools and furniture. They sweep the floor, extinguish the fire, and place a final offering in the corner. With one last look, they step out into the desert sun, joining neighbors on the path toward a greener valley. They do not know if they will return. Perhaps they hope the rains will change, or the river will return to its course. But as the years pass, their absence becomes permanent. Multiply this scene across hundreds of homes, and the image of Carol's twilight emerges. Not chaos, not fire, but an orderly emptiness, a respectful withdrawal from a city that could no longer sustain them. In this way, the household abandonment of Carol tells a story not of sudden destruction, but of quiet resilience. The people adapted not by fighting to the bitter end, but by moving, carrying their traditions into new landscapes, ensuring that Carol's memory would ripple through Andean history long after its plazas fell silent. Oral history fragments. In later cultures, Carol left no written texts, no carved stelae, no codices. Its people spoke, sang, and played music, but they never pressed their language into stone or ink. For archaeologists, this silence is maddening. A civilization so monumental, yet so mute. But silence is never absolute. Words have wings and stories have a way of surviving even when cities fall. Centuries after Carol's plazas emptied, echoes of its twilight may still be heard in the myths, legends, and oral traditions of later Andean peoples. These stories, collected by chroniclers during the time of the Inca Empire in the 16th century, describe a world in which cities vanish beneath sand gods wield floods and droughts as punishment, and entire communities are forced to migrate when rivers betray them. They are not historical accounts in the strict sense, but mythologized memories or fossils that may preserve faint traces of Carol's fate. Cities swallowed by sand. One recurring motif in Andean mythology is the image of cities consumed by the desert. Chroniclers recorded tales of once great settlements buried by shifting sands, their temples and plazas hidden beneath dunes. To the Spanish, these stories may have seemed like fantasy, but to archaeologists who rediscovered Carol and other Soup Valley sites beneath centuries of windblown desert, they feel like cultural memory. The mythic theme of burial by sand resonates with Carol's environment. When the river faltered and fields dried, desert winds would have advanced, covering abandoned buildings with layers of dust and grit. To those who departed, the image of their city slowly disappearing beneath the desert could have become a powerful story, passed down through generations, retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted, until it lived on as myth. Gods of flood and drought. Another powerful thread in Andean oral tradition is the idea of divine retribution through water too much or too little. The Inca and their predecessors told stories of gods who grew angry with humanity and punished them with catastrophic floods, or conversely, with long, killing droughts. This duality of extremes mirrors precisely what the climate evidence reveals about Carol's final centuries: prolonged drought cycles interrupted by devastating El Niño floods. To a people without meteorology, these events would have felt like the direct will of divine powers. Priests would have pleaded with the gods through rituals, music, and offerings. But when the rains did not return, or when floods drowned their crops, the stories that survived were tales of cosmic displeasure. By the time the Inca rose, these narratives had hardened into sacred myths, yet their roots may reach back to the lived experiences of Carol's farmers and priests. Rivers that betray. In one highland myth, recorded by Spanish chroniclers, a community is forced to abandon its home because the river they depended on turned away from them. The phrasing is poetic, but it matches a very real phenomenon documented in the Soup Valley: the gradual shifting of river channels that left Carol's irrigation canals dry. To an ancient Andean farmer, the river was not a mere physical feature, it was a living being, a spirit with will and intention. When it changed course, it was seen not as geological chance, but as betrayal. The memory of such an event would easily pass into legend, told and retold as a warning. Never trust the river forever. It can abandon you when you need it most. Migrants and the echo of memory. Archaeological evidence suggests that Carol's people did not vanish but dispersed, settling in neighboring valleys and carrying their traditions with them. These migrants would have brought not only their skills: cotton cultivation, textile weaving, irrigation, engineering, but also their stories. Over generations, these stories became cultural seed stock. A tale told by a grandparent who had once lived in a city now abandoned could, in time, evolve into myth. Details blurred, events reshaped, meanings spiritualized. By the time of the Inca, such stories may have been centuries old, yet they still retained the kernel of historical truth: that once there had been great cities, undone not by enemies, but by the forces of nature itself. Cultural memory as archaeology of the mind. For archaeologists, oral tradition is a slippery but invaluable tool. It cannot be taken as literal fact, but it often points to underlying truths. Myths of floods often aligned with real flood deposits in the archaeological record. Tales of vanishing rivers echo geological evidence of channel shifts. Legends of sand-buried cities align with the reality of desert encroachment. Thus, even without written records, Carol may live on in the Andean mythic landscape, its fate remembered not in stone inscriptions but in the stories whispered from generation to generation. The enduring echo. Carol's silence is deceptive. Its pyramids may not speak, but its memory reverberates. A farmer in the highlands telling his child a story about rivers that walk away may unknowingly be retelling the echo of Carol's collapse. A ritual dance invoking balance between drought and flood may carry, deep within it, the memory of struggles first lived in the Soup Valley 4,000 years ago. In this sense, Carol never truly died. Its story migrated, reshaped into myth, and absorbed into the great cultural tapestry of the Andes. Myths are not history in the narrow sense, but they are memory in its most human form: fragmented, poetic, symbolic, but enduring. Carol may have left no words of its own, yet its descendants gave it a voice, and that voice still murmurs through the stories of mountains, rivers, droughts, floods, and lost cities that live in the Andean imagination today. Collapse without conquest. What makes Carol truly remarkable is not only the audacity of its architecture: the pyramids rising out of the desert plateau, the planned plazas, the sunken amphitheaters, but the quietness of its ending. In most ancient histories, collapse is written in violence. The familiar script is one of armies pouring through city gates, of fortresses shattered by siege, of flames turning libraries and temples to ash. War has always been archaeology's loudest evidence, leaving behind toppled walls, broken weapons, and human remains contorted in final terror. Yet when we peel back the layers of Carol's soil, that script is absent. There are no charred ruins, no massacres frozen in the dirt, no toppled monuments bearing scars of conquest. Instead, the silence is profound. Homes appear abandoned in order, not in panic. Tools remain where hands once worked them, as though their owners paused, set them down, and never returned. Hearths are covered, floors swept clean, acts that suggest not sudden flight, but ritual closure, a careful saying of goodbye. This is collapse without conquest. A society receding not because of an enemy's blade, but because of forces more ancient, more unyielding, and perhaps more merciless. The slow shift of climate, the fickle flow of rivers, the creeping weight of hunger. Archaeological evidence hints that drought and changing river courses stressed Carol's delicate agricultural balance. Crops failed, fishing yields dwindled. Communities once bound together by trade and shared ceremony may have begun to unravel under the strain of scarcity. The pyramids that had once drawn pilgrims and traders might have become empty monuments, silent reminders of a city's fading heartbeat. And yet, Carol's decline was not absolute erasure. To call it collapse in the modern sense something catastrophic, sudden, and final misses the more subtle truth. Carroll dissolved into transformation. Its people, rather than perishing, adapted. They dispersed into new valleys, carrying with them agricultural knowledge, musical traditions, ceremonial practices, and the memory of a city that had once defied the desert. This is the part that reframes our understanding of collapse. Too often we imagine a civilization's fall as synonymous with failure, a tragic full stop in history. But Carroll's end suggests a different rhythm, one of continuity and renewal. The city as a physical entity may have ceased, but the culture it generated lived on in fragments, absorbed by later Andean societies. In the we glimpse echoes of Carroll's sacred landscapes and ceremonial integration of music. In the Mocha we see a continuation of irrigation expertise, and in the Inca, who would one day build an empire across mountains and deserts, we find faint but persistent resonances of Carroll's communal vision. Thus, Carroll's Twilight is not a story of disappearance, but of metamorphosis. Like a river that dries in one channel only to carve another, Carroll shifted form. Its pyramids remained, gradually swallowed by sand, but its spirit flowed onward into new peoples, new practices, new cities. Collapse here does not mean the end of a people, it means their transformation into something different, their legacy dispersing like seeds carried on the wind. And perhaps this is Carroll's most enduring lesson. Not all collapses roar with violence. Some whisper with quiet departures. Not all endings are endings. Sometimes, as in Carroll, they are beginnings disguised as silence. Conclusion. Lessons of Carroll's Twilight. What, then, can we learn from this city that fell without conquest? Carroll stands in our imagination as something rare in human history, a civilization that flourished without evidence of war, that built not weapons but plazas, amphitheaters, and temples aligned with the sun and stars. And yet, despite all its brilliance, it succumbed not to swords, but to silence. Its decline was not a spectacle of flames, but a whisper of drought and shifting rivers. This is perhaps the most humbling truth. Even the grandest of human creations remain tethered to forces beyond their command. The people of Carroll engineered irrigation systems, organized labor on a vast scale, and cultivated an economy that spanned valleys and coasts. They built pyramids that still rise from the desert floor, testimony to their ingenuity. But they could not command the skies. No leader, no priest, no musician could call down rain when the clouds refused. When the rivers dwindled and fields withered, the limits of human power became clear. Climate does not care for pyramids. The winds do not pause for plazas. Carroll's fall reminds us that all human achievement, no matter how grand, rests upon fragile ecological foundations. And yet within this dependence lies another truth, one less about weakness than about resilience. Carroll's people did not collapse into violence, nor did they vanish overnight. Archaeology tells us that their departure was measured. They swept their floors, covered their hearths, sealed their doorways, and sometimes left small offerings behind, as if closing a chapter with care. These were not the actions of a desperate mob, but of a society choosing to move forward with dignity. The story of Carroll, then, is not a tragedy of destruction, but of transformation. Its people dispersed into new valleys and highland routes, carrying with them fragments of knowledge and memory. Later Andean cultures, long after Carroll's plazas lay silent, still spoke of cities swallowed by sand, of gods who punished people with drought, of communities wandering in search of more faithful rivers. Whether or not those tales directly recall Carroll, they echo the pattern of endurance, memory surviving where monuments fell. This is perhaps Carroll's greatest gift to us. In our own age, we often imagine collapse as apocalypse, burning cities, empty shelves, desperate conflict over dwindling resources. The encouragement reminds us that collapse need not mean oblivion. It can mean carrying forward wisdom, reshaping culture, and finding resilience in community. The ruins of Carroll stand today not as monuments to failure, but as whispers of continuity. In their silence lies a profound lesson, that civilizations may not endure forever in stone, but their spirit can ripple onward, shaping futures they could not imagine. To walk among the pyramids of Carroll is to feel both the weight of impermanence and the persistence of memory. The plazas may be empty, but they are not mute. They tell us that endings are rarely absolute, that in every silence stories remain, that even when rivers vanish and cities crumble, humanity carries forward what matters most, the wisdom written in our stones and the resilience inscribed in our survival. Inca connections. When Carroll fell silent around 1800 BCE, the monumental pyramids did not crumble overnight. They weathered into the desert, half buried by dust storms and shifting rivers. For more than a millennium, silence reigned over the Soup Valley. Yet silence does not mean erasure. Ideas, traditions, and fragments of memory have a way of enduring long after the people who built them are gone. For centuries, scholars debated whether Carroll's influence stretched forward into the mighty empires of the Andes Moors, notably the Inca, who rose some 3,000 years later. The chronological gap is wide, and the connection is not direct like a straight family line, but more like ripples spreading across time. Clues suggest that Carroll's fingerprints can still be seen in the Inca world. Echoes in architecture. The Inca, like Carroll, built their lives around stone, while Inca masonry was more precise and monumental in scale. The foundational idea of shaping landscapes with stepped pyramids, plazas, and ceremonial platforms can be traced back to Carol. The Soup Valley's temples were among the first in the Americas to integrate public ritual spaces with surrounding settlements a blueprint. The Inca would later amplify in cities such as Cusco and ceremonial centers like Machu Picchu. Sacred geometry and duality. Carol's builders organized their city around principles of duality: sun and moon, desert and river, upper and lower halves of the settlement. This idea of balance between opposites would reappear in Inca cosmology, expressed in concepts like Hanan and Huron, upper and lower social divisions. The Inca capital of Cusco was itself divided into such dual halves, mirroring a worldview that may have first been seeded in the Nortico valleys. Music and ritual continuity. While the Inca built a far more elaborate system of terracing, canals, and storehouses, the seed of Andean agricultural innovation was already planted in Carol's time. The same principle, survival through water mastery, defined both civilizations. Myth and memory. Oral traditions often stretch across vast spans of time, preserving echoes of places long abandoned. Some Andean myths speak of ancient cities of great age and forgotten builders, a first civilization that existed before the rise of the known empires. It is tempting to imagine that whispers of Carol survived in myth, carried forward in stories told beside fires, eventually absorbed into Inca lore as memories of the people before, a cultural through-line rather than imagining a direct, unbroken chain from Carol to the Inca. It may be more accurate to see a series of transmissions. One valley influenced the next, one generation borrowed from the memory of its predecessors. Over centuries, cultural DNA migrated across the Andes, recombining, mutating, and resurfacing. Carol was not the mother of the Inca, but perhaps the great-grandmother, civilization distant in time, yet leaving an imprint on the worldview that would later unify an empire stretching thousands of kilometers. Thus, when the Inca priests raised offerings to Inti the sun god, or when architects aligned Cusco's streets with sacred lines called sikhs, they were, consciously or not, carrying forward echoes of a much older wisdom. Carol's pyramids may have turned to sand, but the patterns they etched into the Andean imagination endured. 1. Cultural memory. It is tempting to imagine the Incas, lords of Cusco, builders of Machu Picchu, rulers of a 2,500-mile empire, as entirely separate from Carol. After all, Carol had already been silent for nearly 3 millennia by the time the Incas rose to power. But human societies do not operate in cleanly cut blocks of time, as if each civilization were a separate book placed neatly on a shelf. Memory in the Andes flowed like its rivers, winding, meandering, sometimes flooding, sometimes disappearing underground, only to reappear far away. Unlike the civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Andes did not rely on writing as a way to preserve history. Instead, memory was woven into oral traditions, into myth, song, ritual, and architecture. A story told by one generation became a myth for the next, and a cosmic truth for the one after that. By the time the Incas codified their worldview, the voices of Carol may have been faint, but not entirely gone. One tantalizing thread lies in Inca mythology itself. According to legend, the founders of Inca civilization, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, emerged from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca. They were sent by the sun god Inti to bring order to a world of chaos. Manco taught men the arts of agriculture and governance. Mama Oclo taught women the skills of weaving, domestic management, and moral conduct. This dual origin story, with its clear division of cosmic and social roles between male and female, carries striking resonance with the dualities celebrated in Carol. Archaeologists studying Carol's ritual life have noted the recurring presence of male-female symbolism, not only in figurines but in the very organization of ceremonial spaces. Fire pits were paired with water channels, plazas were balanced by pyramids, and rituals often involved pairs of offerings, suggesting a worldview that placed harmony between opposing forces at its core. This philosophy of balance, male and female, sun and moon, highlands and coast, life and death, would later echo through the heart of Inca cosmology. It may be impossible to prove a direct line of transmission between Carol and the Inca, but ideas in the Andes did not simply vanish when a city collapsed. Migrants carried stories, rituals were adapted by neighbors, myths shifted their shape over centuries. Just as the wind carries seeds far beyond their origin, so too can cultural memory travel. By the time of the Inca, those seeds may have blossomed into new myths, but their roots may still have lain deep in the soil of Carol. In this sense, the Inca may not have consciously remembered Carol. No priest in Cusco could point to the Soup Valley and name it as the origin of their culture, but unconsciously, they may have inherited fragments of that memory. The importance of duality, the sanctity of paired founders, the belief that society begins with balance, not conquest. Carol, though buried in dust, may have whispered through myth into the Inca imagination. 2. Engineering parallels. The Incas are rightly celebrated as master engineers, their achievements often described as miracles of stone. Their empire spanned deserts, jungles, and the towering Andes, yet their cities, roads, and terraces seemed to merge seamlessly with the natural landscape. Spanish chroniclers marveled at walls so perfectly fitted that a blade of grass cannot fit between the stones. Bridges of woven grass stretched across roaring gorges, renewed each year in elaborate communal ceremonies. Terraced fields transformed barren slopes into fertile gardens, feeding millions. To modern eyes, these feats appear revolutionary, but the roots of Andean engineering stretch much further back in time, perhaps as far as Carroll. At Carroll, over 4,000 years earlier, engineers were already grappling with the challenges of an unforgiving environment. The Soup Valley sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, where tectonic plates grind and the desert floor trembles with violent quakes. For a city built of stone and adobe, this posed a deadly problem. Yet Carroll's builders discovered a solution: the shikra bag technique. Woven from plant fibers, these bags were stuffed with stones, then layered within retaining walls and pyramid foundations. When the ground shook, the flexible shikra shifted, dispersing energy and preventing catastrophic collapse. What looks like simple woven fiber was, in fact, a highly effective seismic dampening system, a kind of ancient shock absorber. This principle, flexibility over rigidity, would echo down the centuries. By the time of the Incas, Andean architecture had evolved into a sophisticated language of anti-seismic design. Walls were built with a deliberate inward slope, leaning like the sides of a pyramid. Doors and windows took on a trapezoidal shape, their wider bases providing stability while narrowing upward to release seismic pressure. Stones were cut into irregular, interlocking forms, allowing each block to shift slightly during an earthquake without toppling the structure. Unlike the rigid straight lines of Greek temples or Roman aqueducts, Inca buildings seemed alive, built not to defy the earth but to move with it. The similarities between Carroll and Inca engineering raise profound questions. Was this simply a coincidence? Two societies, separated by millennia, independently solving the same environmental challenge? Or does it hint at a continuous thread of knowledge, passed down across generations of Andean builders, reshaped and refined until it reached its pinnacle in Cusco and Machu Picchu? Archaeologists often caution against drawing direct lines between distant cultures. But in the Andes, where oral tradition carried memory more faithfully than stone inscriptions, practical knowledge could easily have survived in the techniques of builders, farmers, and masons. There is also the matter of scale and philosophy. At Carroll, architecture was not merely functional. The massive sunken plazas and tiered pyramids were designed for ritual as much as for shelter. The engineering served cosmology. Plazas represented the womb of the earth. Pyramids, the mountains where gods dwelled. Staircases, the ascent of human beings toward the divine. In Inca cities, the same integration of function and meaning can be seen. Cusco was laid out in the shape of a puma, its head a fortress. Terraces doubled as both agricultural innovations and spiritual offerings to Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Engineering was never just practical, it was cosmological. Even their water systems bear comparison. Carroll's canals, drawing river water into a desert landscape, prefigure the Inca mastery of hydraulic engineering. At sites like Inca aqueducts carried mountain springs across terraced hillsides with precision that still astounds modern engineers. Both civilizations treated water not only as a necessity, but as a sacred element to be guided, honored, and celebrated. In this light, Inca engineering was not an isolated genius, but part of a long Andean tradition, a tradition in which Carroll may have played the role of the first great teacher. Its pyramids, plazas, and shikra bags stand as silent ancestors to the interlocking stones of Machu Picchu and the mighty terraces of the Sacred Valley, where one civilization experimented, another perfected, and together they reveal a truth about the Andes. Here, survival required harmony with a restless earth, and those who thrived were those who learned to build not against nature, but with it. 3. Roads and trade. The Inca road system, the Capac, is often described as one of the great marvels of the ancient world. Stretching more than 25,000 miles, it carved paths across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Deserts that receive less than an inch of rain a year, valleys that flood with seasonal torrents, and mountain passes soaring above 16,000 feet. These roads were not simply dirt tracks. They were meticulously engineered with stone pavements, drainage systems, and suspension bridges woven from grass. Along the routes, the Incas built tambos, way stations where travelers could rest and armies could resupply, and chasqui runners relayed messages across the empire with astonishing speed. More than transportation, the road system was a circulatory system of power, allowing Cusco's authority to reach the empire's farthest corners. Yet this dazzling achievement did not arise in a vacuum. The roots of Andean connectivity stretch back thousands of years to Carroll. Though Carroll lacked stone highways or imperial ambitions, it sat at the crossroads of a vast exchange network. Excavations in the Soup Valley reveal a stunning array of good spondylus shells carried from the warm waters off Ecuador's coast, prized both for their rarity and their association with fertility rituals. Coca leaves cultivated in the eastern Andean slopes, long valued for their stimulant and ritual properties. Quinoa, cotton, and beans grown locally and traded for anchovies and dried fish from the nearby Pacific. In Carroll, trade was not supplemental, it was foundational. The desert valley itself could not sustain large populations without constant flows of resources from other regions. In this way, Carroll pioneered what would become a defining feature of Andean civilization: the vertical archipelago. Rather than relying on a single ecological zone, societies wove together the bounty of mountains, jungles, and coasts into a shared economy. This system of complementarity, exchanging highland potatoes for coastal fish, lowland fruits for mountain textiles, created webs of interdependence that endured for millennia. When we compare Carroll's networks with the later Inca roads, the parallels become striking. Carroll's exchanges were fluid and organic, carried out by traders, kin groups, and ritual specialists. The Inca, by contrast, turned those pathways into a rigid infrastructure of empire, formalized and militarized to serve Cusco's expansion. Yet beneath the imperial polish lay the same Andean logic. Survival and prosperity depended on stitching together distant worlds. Even culturally, trade was never just about food or goods. At Carroll, ritual items like exotic shells and rare pigments were imbued with spiritual meaning, carried hundreds of miles to be used in ceremonial centers. At Inca way stations, offerings of coca, chicha, beer, and woven textiles bound travelers into shared rituals of hospitality and loyalty to the state. In both cases, exchange created not only economic lifelines, but also cultural glue, binding people across deserts, rivers, and mountains into a single imagined community. Thus, when we trace the lineage of Andean trade, Carroll appears not as an isolated experiment but as a prototype for empire. It set into motion the rhythms of connectivity that, centuries later, would allow the Incas to govern one of the most formidable landscapes on Earth. One, earthquake-resistant architecture. When you walk through the ruins of Carroll, one of the first things you notice is not just the scale of the pyramids, plazas, and staircases, but their survival. For millennia have passed, yet the foundations endure, clinging to the desert as if time itself had become another stone in their walls. For a civilization so ancient, the very fact that these structures are still standing is extraordinary. But when you look closer, the survival of Carroll is not a miracle. It is engineering. Carroll lies in one of the most seismically volatile belts on Earth. The Nazca Plate grinds relentlessly beneath the South American plate, generating earthquakes that can devastate entire cities. In modern times, the region has suffered tragedies that live on in memory. The 1970 Ancash earthquake, which buried towns under landslides and killed over 70,000 people. The 2007 Pisco quake, which leveled much of Ica, leaving tens of thousands homeless. Every generation in Peru knows the terror of trembling ground. And yet, Carroll's pyramids have stood through thousands of such events. The secret lies in a technology that feels both simple and astonishingly forward-thinking. The shikra system. Carroll's builders wove baskets from reeds and fibers, filling them with loose stones, then stacked them as foundations in retaining walls. These were not rigid monoliths, but living structures, designed to shift, sway, and absorb shock. When tremors shook the Soup Valley, the shikros flexed, dispersing the seismic energy instead of resisting it head-on. In effect, the pyramids of Carroll were designed to dance with the earth rather than defy it. It is a principle echoed thousands of years later in Inca architecture. In Cusco, Machu Picchu, and Ollantaytambo, trapezoidal windows, interlocking stones, and tilted walls embody the same philosophy. Flexibility is strength. Modern structural engineers marvel at these techniques, admitting that many of today's concrete and steel constructions fail where ancient stone and fiber have succeeded. In recent years, Peruvian researchers and architects have begun to re-examine these ancient systems with fresh urgency. Could the wisdom of Carroll be applied to modern rural housing, particularly in earthquake-prone Andean communities where resources are scarce? The answer seems to be yes. Tests suggest that shikra-inspired foundations using biodegradable bags, woven textiles, or even recycled materials can significantly reduce collapse risk during quakes, at a fraction of the cost of reinforced concrete. Here lies a deep irony, even a quiet warning. In our pursuit of modern progress, societies often overlook the solutions that lie beneath their feet, encoded in traditions older than history. Carroll teaches that resilience does not always require expensive innovation. Sometimes, it requires remembering. Today, when engineers look at Carroll's enduring pyramids, they do not just see a ruin, they see a message carried across 5,000 years. Build with the earth, not against it. In a warming, increasingly unstable world where natural disasters are more frequent and devastating, this message has never been more urgent. 2. Sustainable desert agriculture. Carroll's very existence is a paradox. To stand in the Soup Valley today is to see an arid landscape where the desert stretches endlessly. A place where the sky seems reluctant to rain and the earth yields little without coaxing. And yet, nearly 5,000 years ago, people here built one of humanity's first great cities. The question practically demands itself: how did they feed themselves in a place so hostile to agriculture? The answer lies in a sophisticated relationship with nature, one that modern science is only now beginning to appreciate. Carroll's people were not passive victims of their environment. They engineered it. They diverted water from the nearby rivers through carefully constructed irrigation canals, ensuring that every drop was stretched to its fullest use. Unlike later empires that often depleted their soils or over-irrigated until salt ruined the fields, Carroll's farmers worked with restraint. They chose crops with precision. Cotton became the city's economic lifeline. Though inedible, it was indispensable. With it, they crafted fishing nets that supported their coastal trade. Nets, in turn, meant anchovies, a staple protein not grown on desert soil but hauled in vast quantities from the Pacific Ocean. The inland city was thus bound to the sea by threads of cotton, creating a symbiotic economy that thrived across ecosystems. At the same time, they cultivated squash, beans, guava, sweet potatoes, and medicinal plants, crops that required less water than cereals like wheat. They designed a balance: economic crops that fed their economy, subsistence crops that fed their people, and trade networks that fed their connections. It was an ecological mosaic, sustainable precisely because it was diversified. Today, this strategy feels prophetic in regions like California's Central Valley, where aquifers are being drained at alarming rates, or North Africa, where desertification is advancing. Carroll's approach offers a blueprint: cultivate crops that match the land, avoid overdependence on a single resource, and treat agriculture as both an ecological and economic system. The lessons echo forward. In a climate-stressed world, the oldest solutions may be the wisest. 3P studies applications. Yet Carroll's true enigma is not in what they grew, but in what they did not do. Unlike their contemporaries in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley, the people of Carroll built no defensive walls. Their pyramids were grand, but they were not citadels. Their plazas were vast, but they were not parade grounds for armies. Archaeologists searching for weapons or mass graves find nothing. For nearly a millennium, a civilization flourished without war. This discovery is startling because it overturns one of history's most persistent assumptions: that organized violence is a prerequisite for complex societies. In Mesopotamia, city-states rose and fell in ceaseless battles for territory. In Egypt, pharaohs carved their victories on temple walls. Even in the Indus Valley, fortifications stand as silent witnesses to conflict. But in Carroll, power seems to have been expressed through other means. The glue that held society together may have been ritual and culture. The amphitheaters suggest gatherings for music and performance. Instruments such as bone flutes and cornets have been found, hinting at a civilization where sound itself was a binding force. Instead of training armies, they trained communities to gather, to celebrate, and to participate in collective life. Trade, too, played its part. When your survival depends on the flow of anchovies from the coast and cotton from the valley, stability is in everyone's interest. Violence disrupts trade. Cooperation sustains it. In Carroll, prosperity came not from conquest but from connection. This has electrified modern peace studies. It suggests that societies can achieve complexity without militarization, that cultural cohesion and economic interdependence can substitute for violence. For scholars, Carroll becomes not just an archaeological site but a case study in alternative power. It resonates today in debates over nuclear disarmament, peace-building, and conflict resolution. Carroll whispers across millennia: perhaps another world is possible. For a legacy reclaimed for centuries, Carroll was forgotten. Winds buried its pyramids under layers of sand, and the valley fell silent. Locals thought the mounds were natural hills, unremarkable in a desert filled with stone and dust. Only in the late 20th century did archaeologists begin to uncover its magnitude, revealing that hidden beneath the earth was not just a city, but an entire civilization that rewrote the story of the Americas. Today, Carroll is being claimed back into human memory. It is recognized as one of the world's oldest urban centers, contemporaneous with the pyramids of Egypt and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Yet it offers something different, a vision of civilization not built on war, but on balance. Its legacy works on two levels. Historically, it is the forgotten ancestor of Andean civilizations, a precursor to the Inca who inherited the Andes tradition of terrace farming, astronomy, and road networks. Philosophically, it is a living laboratory for our present dilemmas. In a time of environmental strain, Carol teaches water-smart agriculture. In a time of perpetual conflict, it shows a path of peace. Perhaps the most profound lesson is this: history is not a ladder climbing inevitably upward through conquest and empire. Sometimes, civilizations thrive precisely because they avoid those paths. Sometimes, resilience comes not from domination, but from restraint. Carol's voice, long muted beneath the desert, now speaks again. It tells us that the future need not be a repetition of the past's wars and excesses. It suggests that survival, even prosperity, may lie in listening to each other, to the earth, and to the quiet wisdom of those who came before. The question is no longer whether Carol has something to teach us. The question is whether we, in the modern world, are ready to learn. Carol is silent now. The winds that sweep across the Soup Valley whisper through broken stone walls, carrying grains of desert sand into the stairways of pyramids that once reached toward the heavens. Llamas graze in the distance. The Soup River flows sluggishly, almost indifferent, as if it has seen this story 1,000 times before. And yet, Carol refuses to disappear. Though its people vanished, its voice still echoes. Through Shikra foundations, through Kipu cords, through the very bones of its pyramids. 4,000 years of earthquakes, droughts, and storms could not erase this city. It waits for us, daring us to listen. But what is it trying to say? The mystery of the end. Every civilization has its twilight. Rome had its barbarians. The Maya faced droughts and dynastic collapse. The Indus Valley fell to shifting rivers and trade routes that dried up. Carol too ended. But how? Theories abound. Climate collapse. Geological records hint at a megadrought around 1800 BCE, when the El Niño cycle grew harsher. The Soup River may have thinned, anchovy stocks may have vanished, and farmers faced barren fields. Migration, instead of dying in fire and war, Carol may have dissolved peacefully. Families, little by little, may have packed their gourds, quippers, and flutes, walking inland or along the coast, carrying Carol's DNA into later cultures like the conflict avoided. Some argue Carol fell not because it was weak, but because it was too idealistic. Unlike later Andean empires, Carol left behind no weapons, no fortifications, no bloody murals of conquest. In a world where scarcity sharpened teeth, perhaps Carol's refusal to wage war doomed it. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't end at all. Perhaps its people became the seeds of every civilization that followed in the Andes. Maybe the Incas' great road system, their reverence for astronomy, their organizational genius, all trace back to Carol. In this way, Carol never fell. It simply transformed. Carol is more than a ruin, it's a mirror. And when we peer into it, we don't just see the past, we see ourselves. Resilience in crisis. The Shikra technique whispers a forgotten truth. Survival isn't always about stronger walls, but smarter ones. Carol teaches that locust sustainable resilience is possible if we respect nature's rhythms. Harmony over war. Imagine a society that thrived for centuries without fortresses or armies. Carol forces us to ask, do humans need violence to build empires, or can cooperation and trade achieve the same greatness, sustainability and collapse? Carol's fall, whether from drought, migration or disintegration, warns us of our own fragility. Climate change today threatens to unravel modern cities with the same ruthless force that humbled Carol. Will we listen to the warnings carved into its ruins, or will we too vanish into silence? The power of culture. Carols, quippers, and flutes remind us that numbers and art are equally essential. Trade and song, economy and ceremony were not separate, they were one. In our modern world of specialization and division, perhaps Carol's greatest lesson is integration. So what do we make of Carol? A city without walls, a people without swords, a culture without kings carved in stone. In a world obsessed with power, Carol dared to dream of something else, and for nearly 1,000 years, it worked. Maybe that's the real miracle on it. Its pyramids, not its quippers, but the simple fact that Carol found another way to exist. And now, the question shifts from what happened to Carol, to what will happen to us. So what do you think happened to Carol? Did they see the end coming? Could they have survived if they had adopted warfare like the Incas? Or was their collapse inevitably sacrificed to history's endless cycle of rise and fall? Drop your theories in the comments. I'll pin the most mind-blowing one. Who knows, you might solve one of history's greatest mysteries. If you've made it this far, you're officially a Carol expert. And trust me, There aren't many of those out there. So hit that subscribe button, because next week we're diving into something even stranger. The 12,000-year-old underwater city in India. And if Carol made you rethink the past, that one will make Carol look young. Turn on notifications, you don't want to miss this. As the camera pans out over the Soup Valley, the pyramids of Carol glow in the fading light, their staircases catching fire in the last rays of the sun. For a brief moment, it almost feels alive again, like priests and farmers and musicians are about to walk out from the stones, carrying baskets of corn and playing flutes made from pelican bones. But then the wind shifts, and the city is silent once more, and we are left with a single thought. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of lost cities still out there, waiting to rewrite everything we know about human history. Maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one to find the next Carol.